I used to be a trucker way back in the day, and I've had all sorts of weird encounters and experiences, especially at truck stops. Those are not places you want to be late at night. But anyway, what I'm here to tell you about is something that I simply cannot explain, and there's no writing it off as something I dreamt or made up or had a vision of. This was a real flesh and blood creature. Let me explain. I was currently en route, and actually around the Point Pleasant area in Virginia, when I felt a heavy thud on the back of my cargo trailer. I decided to pull over since it felt like there was some added weight. After pulling over, I got out of my truck, and as soon as I got out and looked up at the top of the trailer, I was horrified by what I saw. Standing there on top of my cargo trailer was what I would describe to you, or what I know now as the Mothman. The first thing I saw were these two giant red glowing orbs. I nearly fell back onto my butt when I saw this. Then I saw the shape surrounding it and just how large it was. In fact, I probably saw the wings first before I did the rest of the body. It was getting dusk out, so it was pretty dark, and there wasn't a whole lot of light. So that's why I saw the eyes first, more than the body. But as soon as I saw this thing, it didn't take me more than 5 seconds before I saw all I wanted to, and I ran back in my truck, and I floored it out of there. I guess this thing must have took off, because as I'm pulling out into the road, not only did I do it recklessly and dangerously, not even flipping on my blinker, this thing must have flew off. But when I got out to look at it, it looked right at me. Now, at the time, I had no idea there was such a thing called the Mothman, and if you had told me about it then, I would have laughed at you, telling you that you're making up fake horror stories. Well, I was quickly proved wrong. After telling some of my friends about it, they told me that that area, Point Pleasant, is actually a hotbed for Mothman sightings. And you guessed it, I just happened to be a lucky individual to have my own very sighting of this supposed thing. The thing is, I don't consider myself lucky one bit. It was terrifying. It was almost a traumatic experience. Maybe not going that far, but I have no desire to run into this thing again, nor do I want to see it. After spending some time online and reading some encounters and sightings, there's actually a plethora of sightings of this same creature floating all around the internet. And well, I haven't taken the time to write mine down and submit it to all these websites. I thought I could start by sending in mine to yours, and hopefully, if I'm lucky, you'll read it, because maybe somebody else who has had their own encounter with something entirely different, or maybe the same creature, will hear this and understand that they are not crazy or alone. You gotta understand that when you see something like this, that it is so far out of the realm of normal that you begin to suspect you're losing it, that you're going crazy, and that you're not right in the head. I thought that for quite some time afterwards, until I was finally brave enough, or maybe the feeling bothered me enough that I had to tell somebody about what happened. Anyway, I'm not going to drag this on forever. You don't need to tell me twice the Mothman is out there, and I'm going to do everything I can to avoid ever going back there. Luckily, I don't have that same job anymore, so I have no reason to go back there. Count me lucky, I guess. Back in 1972, my grandfather recounts to me that at the time, he was working as a car salesman and even was working on starting his own car business. That was until my grandfather's business fell into total financial ruin and my grandmother passed away shortly after. But something happened that he can't quite explain, that he believes was a demon, an omen that visited him, and possibly projected evil onto his life. At the time, my grandmother and grandfather lived far on the outskirts in Chicago. They actually lived in a much more rural area. I believe it was north, but it might be east. I could be wrong. Either way, one night my grandfather was driving home, and he said that he was stopped in the middle of the road by this demon with 2 wings and large glowing red eyes. Keep in mind that at the time, he had never heard of the Mothman or heard of such a thing. Since it was only 1972, media outlets didn't really have a great way of going global yet or across the U.S. If you didn't have the newspaper, well, you didn't really know anything unless it was word of mouth. My grandfather swears this is true, that this evil being flew down to the middle of the road and spoke telepathically to my grandfather. My grandfather actually never fully told me what this thing told him telepathically, but from what happened afterwards, he said it touched his life in the worst way. 3 months after this encounter, his wife, my grandmother, came down with stage 4 cancer and passed away just a few months later. During that time, his business also seemed to go sour, having to file complete bankruptcy and leading to financial ruin. My grandfather turned to alcoholism for 12 years before finally joining AA and turning his life around. Today, my grandfather is alive, healthy, old as can be, and he eventually remarried. But he still can't refute that is one of the scariest things that has ever happened to him, and he believes that it is a supernatural omen that came to destroy his life, or so he believes. Personally, I'm not really sure what to think about it, although it is rather convincing, because my grandfather is not a storyteller. It's just weird how this thing appeared out of nowhere and projected its own negativity onto his life. And to this day, my grandfather firmly believes that whatever this thing was, which he now knows as a Mothman, or was the Mothman, is the one that caused his wife to die and his business to nosedive into financial ruin. The only thing I can really make out of my grandfather's story is that I do know that some people believe the Mothman is actually a bad omen and only appears when a catastrophe is about to happen. It would make sense, since its first appearance was right before the Silver Bridge collapsed in 1967, only about 6 or 7 years prior to my grandfather's encounter. And then, shortly after appearing to my grandfather, his wife dying and his business going sour. How else would you describe that? What could it have possibly been? Is it possible that the Mothman is actually a demon? I used to live in Point Pleasant about 9 years ago for about 1.5 years because I worked a job down there, in which case I ended up moving because I got married. I'll spare you an incredibly long and boring backstory and just cut right to the chase. During my time there, even though I was only there 1.5 years, I quickly made a lot of friends and grew to be a small part of the community, knowing and getting to talk a lot of people. You wouldn't believe the number of sightings that I had heard firsthand. It was enough to make a believer out of me, some of whom were very credible witnesses, like previous sheriff deputies or first responders, and they each had their own harrowing stories. Sadly, I come to you with no encounters of my own, but I can tell you from all the eyewitness stories that I had heard, it's pretty terrifying what's going on down there. Apparently, this cryptid, I guess you call it, is running rampant. Sometimes people seeing it chasing them and attacking their car. Other times, people will see it flying around in the sky. Another man who had seen it jumping from tree to tree on his way on a lone road. When I first moved down there, I had actually never heard of the local legend myself, until I quickly befriended many people in the community, and that's when it became more and more out. I was even warned about certain places around town you shouldn't go after dark. Yeah, it got that crazy, but I didn't really pay any attention. I was kind of a loner anyway, as far as going around town. I kept to myself for the most part. I didn't really explore a whole lot. I kind of just stayed home, went to a couple friends' houses here and there, was a small part of the community for some time, but I didn't really go all over the town, if that makes sense. Like I said though, the most credible and real witnesses to me were the previous employees of the sheriff's department and first responders. Their accounts were harrowing and terrifying to listen to, many of them having their very own first-hand accounts themselves. And even the deputies, or previous deputies, man, their stories were more than enough to send chills down my spine. If you haven't really heard of the Mothman, or haven't gotten a chance to explore the Mothman, I encourage you to start Googling and looking up sightings and encounters. I promise it won't disappoint you. After being down there and being enriched in that culture and hearing all the sightings and encounters, it just proved to me right then and there that maybe monsters really do exist.